In order to discuss Garmonbozia, we first have to establish what it is. In the canon of Twin Peaks, Garmonbozia is a substance that has the appearance of creamed corn. Garmonbozia is literally pain and sorrow, specifically the pain and sorrow that the spirits of Twin Peaks feast off of people. In Fire Walk With Me, Bob seems to be attempting to extract as much Garmonbozia from Laura as she can. In terms of the metaphor and the narrative, this is implying that Bob is attempting to cause as much pain and suffering as he can in Laura to maximize the feast that the Twin Peaks spirits do. It's very important that Garmonbozia is creamed corn. Let's discuss why. In The Return, Hawk shows Frank Truman a cloth, and this cloth shows a number of things, including the good and bad fires that Hawk refers to as like electricity. This cloth is in many ways sort of a map of the themes of Twin Peaks, and there's one detail that's super important. The black fire is burning crops of corn. Now let's talk about corn in the context of American history. Corn is an indigenous crop to the Americas that had been used by indigenous populations for a long time prior to European colonization. When Europeans colonized the Americas, they started extracting corn as a resource, basically stealing the crops from indigenous people and using them for various things such as food, oil, and other such useful things. The reality of European colonization is that it was brutal to the indigenous populations and would be more accurately categorized as a genocide. The results of colonization were a huge depletion of the indigenous population through violence, slavery, and disease, a huge depletion of the natural resources due to capitalist modes of production, and the forced integration of indigenous agriculture and lands into quote-unquote Western life. Corn became a very important piece of the industries of America. Americans turned corn into an essential crop for its economy and the basic fabric of our lives. It's used in so many things. It's basically all we eat. It's a lot of what we drink. It's a part of our clothes and so many other things. Corn is an essential crop. Now, are you still with me? Here's where it gets interesting. Creamed corn was a popular dish in 1950s America, the era of America that Twin Peaks is largely referencing. Creamed corn is a commodified, denaturalized version of corn that post-colonized America made. Corn is a natural crop indigenous to the Americas that was exploited during colonization in its history, traces through a long history of genocide and exploitation in the United States and prior to its nationhood. Creamed corn is, in our own lives, a symbol of colonization and the white supremacy that motivated it. It's the unnatural result of white society exploiting the natural resources of the Americas. Now think about the chain of events. Corn, a natural crop that can be used well or poorly, gets extracted forcefully by white America, then processed until it's basically terrible for you, and then sold as a popular food dish to what I assume must have been a largely white American audience as creamed corn. This is basically the same problem that people are themselves experiencing in this era of American history. The forced integration of people into a white supremacist, capitalist, post-World War II suburbia disconnects them from their natural place of origin and puts them into this fake, commodified capitalist world. The story of corn is the story of America. The story of creamed corn is the story of America in the 20th century. Creamed corn is not just pain and sorrow, it's pain and sorrow that emanates from America's deep cultural problems, including the exploitation of natural resources and people in a capitalist society. Basically, what I'm saying is that Garmonbozia is the extracted benefits of the commodified body and soul, the soul that's been robbed of its natural environment and placed into an American suburban hell. Garmonbozia is the pain and sorrow that America feels, and that's a specific pain. The pain and sorrow of colonization and industrialization, removing natural resources and people from their natural state and repackaging them in an unnatural, unhealthy, and destructive state. Its existence as creamed corn is emblematic of the cruelty that the American system has forced onto indigenous populations, onto the natural lands it was built on, and onto the American people as well. Laura's exploitation is reflective not just of her unique situation, but of America's broader situation and its broader history of violence towards the marginalized. She, a human being, has been turned into a commodity. And as such, commodity is what the spirits of the town extract from her. Very bad people stand to benefit from this exploitation. But the connection is there. This exploitation is not just in Laura's life, it's woven into the history of the land itself. We're going to take three major diversions. First, let's talk about The Matrix. Spoilers, of course, for The Matrix. works. The Matrix is a film where the central premise is that there are two layers of reality. The first is a simulated reality, a literal computer simulation known as the Matrix. The second is the quote-unquote real world. The Matrix will help us understand Twin Peaks for a very simple reason. The Matrix's primary story device is a layer of what I'll call unreality, in this case a computer simulation, that has been devised by machines within the canon of the universe to obscure a dark truth underneath, which is the exploitation of mankind by said machines. The Matrix exists to prevent humans from learning about the real world. The second major diversion is Die Hard, so major spoilers for Die Hard. In Die Hard, John McClane has a troubled relationship with his ex-wife who he is attempting to reconcile with. His wife isn't interested. They're attending a Christmas party at her company, a very high-end company in a skyscraper in Los Angeles. Terrorists enter the building, holding people hostage, killing the CEO of the company, and attempting to get away with a large sum of money before leaving. John McClane manages to sneak away before the terrorists find him, and a cat-and-mouse game begins, in which McClane bravely saves the lives of the hostages, including specifically saving his wife's life and killing many of the terrorists in the process. The two reconcile their differences at the end and appear to be happy together. The third diversion is to Blue Velvet, Lynch's previous film before Twin Peaks. In Blue Velvet, we see the opening scene of a picket fence suburban dream, the quote-unquote American dream, and then pan down to reveal underneath the lawn that there are bugs. I've described this scene as Lynch's thesis statement, and it very much is. The intended meaning is that behind the facade of American culture is a dark truth that, when exposed, will allow us to understand the issues in the culture and work to fix them. How do these three films relate to each other? Not in any substantial way, but they will make sense together and aid in our discussion. Lynch's style has been described as surreal, abstract, strange, and of course, Lynchian. This style does not exist purely for its own sake. In fact, the tendency to view things as existing primarily in the realm of aesthetics is, to me, fairly dangerous. All art, whether it wants to or not, has political meanings. It also has interpersonal meanings, cultural meanings, individual meanings, aesthetic meanings, emotional meanings. All art is loaded with meaning. The Matrix will help us in conceptualizing unreality as a concept. Lynch doesn't have a clear divide between what is canonically supposed to be real in the fiction of his work or what is canonically supposed to be unreal. Lynch is, instead, interested primarily in narratives. All narratives are fiction. All art is fiction. All art says things about the real world through fiction. So the unreal, the fiction, is not distinct from any canonically real thing. Think about it this way. The Matrix is not a real thing, but the quote-unquote real world in that series is not real either. Both are fiction. Lynch self-consciously acknowledges fictionality throughout his work in a very postmodern sense. In Mulholland Drive, he calls attention to diegesis in order to make the viewer aware of the construction of sound and image in his film and the way in which these things are fictional in nature. The Matrix's major marketing campaign was, "What is the Matrix?" The marketing didn't reveal the film's central premise that we are living inside a computer simulation, but it provoked a question that would cause people to want to see the film to get answers. Importantly, behind that question are additional questions. Who made the Matrix? Where did it come from? Why does it exist? What purpose does it serve? Twin Peaks employs a similar tactic, albeit without a clear answer. Twin Peaks asks the big question, starting in Firewalk with Me, and especially gaining ground in The Return. We live inside a dream, but who is the dreamer? This cryptic question has been approached by many fans in terms of in-universe answers. The dreamer is Laura, or the dreamer is Dale, or Audrey, or everyone. Sometimes people approach it primarily through metafiction. The dreamer is Lynch, or Lynch and Frost, or even the audience. You, me, we are the dreamer. The question doesn't have a canonical answer, but it is meant to provoke interest in what the answer could be. If this is all a dream, then who is the dreamer? If this is all a matrix, then who is the architect? Indeed, Lynch's work operates in a manner similar to The Matrix, albeit not with a canonical, easy computer simulation type answer. Instead, Lynch works within certain narratives. Twin Peaks, rather than having a canonical fake world and real world, has multiple states of unreality that can be peeled away or covered up. This unreality could be likened to The Matrix as a point of reference, something that isn't real that obscures some deeper truth. In my opinion, answering the question, who is the dreamer, is better answered by going back to Blue Velvet. In Blue Velvet, after we see Lynch's big thesis for the film in the opening scene, we see the metaphor play out in the actual narrative of the film. Behind the facade of American suburbia, there exists Frank Booth, an abusive rapist who is holding Dorothy Valens as a sex slave by holding her husband and son hostage. He's also a drug king. Disturbed by what Jeffrey has learned, he asks Stanley an important question. Why are there people like Frank? This is an abstract question, but there is something resembling an answer in the film itself. We learn that Frank is working with someone in the police force. They're conspiring together. So the answer is, at least in part, this. People like Frank exist because they are given power. The American dream, the suburban dream that we live in, gives cover to Frank, which allows him to exploit people like Dorothy. Once Jeffrey is able to see that the system gives Frank power, he's able to oppose Frank in a more meaningful way. Twin Peaks carries these themes heavily. Why are there people like Leland Palmer? Because the facade of American traditionalism allows him to exploit others. Our culture's facade exists to cover up the dark truth underneath, the dark truth of exploitation and harm. The town of Twin Peaks is, in a sense, the white picket fence suburb that obscures the dark truth of Leland Palmer and his ongoing abuse of his own daughter, Laura. In Twin Peaks, there are layers of the unreal. Twin Peaks, the town, is an unreality, a facade that hides a reality of abuse. Then there's a sort of layer of unreality to the whole universe of the show, as it hides a darkness, a spiritual sickness that manifests from the cultural issues of America throughout our history. Then there's the meta layer, the unreality of the fiction of the show, and the unreality of fiction more generally. These are all like proverbial matrices that, when one becomes aware of their existence, can see behind them, into a more honest understanding of the world, and then ask the important question: who is the architect? What purpose does this matrix serve? Or in Twin Peaks terms, who is the dreamer? The big question that I'd like to propose for understanding Twin Peaks and Lynch's work more broadly is: who is the architect of the unreality we see before us in this media? The easy answer is Lynch, but let's not focus so much on the films and focus more on the cultural reference points that the films represent. Mulholland Drive, for example, is about Hollywood's exploitation of women. Who is the architect of that exploitation? And now let's go back to Die Hard. Or rather, let's go back to the era in which Die Hard was made, the same era in which Twin Peaks was made. In my original video for this series, my intro video where I went into my general thesis for all of Lynch's original works, I talked about how the 1980s saw a huge shift in relationships between gender, race, sexuality, and class. Reagan and the neoconservative movement that backed him had a specific task of ending the civil rights, feminist, and gay liberation movements and reversing their efforts in order to reinstate a 1950s traditionalism that was advantageous to them. As I said in that video, this 50s traditionalism was a facade that obscured a dark truth of ongoing abuse of those various groups. This is why those movements spawned, because they were revealing the dark truth of 50s conservatism and opposing it, fighting for equality. Lynch's work references this exact facade and opposes it, not just because it's bad and it was part of his life as a kid, but because Reagan was attempting to retroactively push us back into the darkness, into the facade. Reagan was attempting to end the opportunity to fix America and make it a place where everyone could prosper and reinstate an America that uses a glamorous traditionalism to cover up grave injustices and exploitation. Blue Velvet was a brutally honest depiction of this cover-up, as was Twin Peaks. This is not just in reference to Reagan's political climate, but the media climate as well. In the 1980s, conservative media giants worked to placate large audiences of people by creating post-race, post-feminist, and post-gay narratives, acknowledging the existence of these things while also appealing to a return to tradition, a return to a white supremacist, patriarchal, heteronormative hierarchy. This isn't me injecting my thoughts into this. This is what actually happened. There were books written at the time and in retrospect about this, and one of the most popular films of the 80s directly alludes to this, that film being John Carpenter's They Live, which he has personally claimed was a response to the deregulation of capitalism. The mass media campaign in the 80s involved advertising, deregulation, and importantly, media narratives that constructed normative notions of race, gender, class, and sexuality. I want to very quickly explain what normativity is. Normativity is the idea that things should be a certain way. Heteronormativity, for example, is the idea that people naturally are, inevitably are, and ought to be heterosexual. So a heteronormative narrative in a film is one which suggests that heterosexuality is just the way people are, and it's the way people should be. The normative view on gender is patriarchy, the idea that men ought to have the power in society, that women ought not to have any power, and that men should use this power to control women, effectively owning them for the purposes of sex, reproduction, family raising, etc. The normative view on race is that white people ought to have power in society, people of color ought not to have power, and white people should use this power to control people of color, so on and so forth with many groups. So in the 1980s, a number of post-race and post-feminist narratives came forward, suggesting that yes, people of color are empowered, and yes, women are empowered. but feminism and civil rights doesn't empower them. Instead, adherence to white supremacy and patriarchy is what empowers them. They allude to the idea that black people really are equal now and that women really are equal without any proof of such a thing. In many films, such as Die Hard, black sidekicks build a sense of camaraderie with white heroes through displays of masculinity and heterosexuality. They relate to one another, empathize with one another. They're both humans, they both bleed, they both yearn. The narrative is clear. Black people are equal to white people. However, the normative framework isn't avoided. White men are still the heroes, and black men are not. Die Hard does the exact same thing with women. McClane feels entitled to his wife, but she has quote-unquote autonomy. She chooses to reject him, and then she chooses to save his life through the act of claiming to have a different last name, thus not revealing that she has any relation to John, and then she chooses to reconcile with him after he saves people. She is quote-unquote empowered. She's not treated purely as a damsel in distress, but the normative framework isn't avoided. Men are still the heroes, women are not. Importantly as well, men are still entitled to women, and through displays of heroism and masculine power, earn women by default. Die Hard is a normative portrayal of gender and race in this regard. It eludes the idea that it is feminist and anti-racist, but it still promotes the dominant conservative attitude that we should not allow women or people of color to have power, and we should all continue to rely on white men to serve in our best interest. This reality of media with normative, conservative messages was omnipresent in media of the time. Now here's where things get interesting. Lynch's work serves as a counter-narrative. He is forcing us to contend with the normative framework of media at large by presenting stories which initially begin with a normative framework, then counteract, complicate, and defy that framework in order to reveal something behind that normativity. Behind the glisten of Reagan's messages about tradition is the reality that tradition meant the brutal mistreatment of women. The dark truth more broadly of Lynch's work is that media has been involved in a massive campaign to condition people towards believing we live in a world where there is no need for liberal movements for equality, and that returning to the tradition set forth in the immediate aftermath of World War II is what will be best for society. This is the narrative that the conservative base of America have been trying to pull since the end of World War II. It's very prominent in a lot of the media in the 1980s, and in some regards has continued in media to this day, and it's the narrative that Lynch is broadly opposing in almost all of his work. Lynch's statements can be read on several levels because the levels are all related to one another. Our spiritual well-being is affected by our personal well-being, is affected by our interpersonal well-being, is affected by our social and cultural well-being, is affected by our existential well-being, etc. Our media ties into all of this, as does our local community, our family unit, our state, our nation, our place in history. And within all of these, there are images that are presented to us that limit our understandings and sometimes spread misinformation and obscure real dangers. This is the basics of postmodern theory, and it's present in a lot of Lynch's work. Fire Walk With Me is so densely layered specifically because it's part of a broader series. Twin Peaks was playing off of ideas presented in Blue Velvet, Fire Walk With Me expands a lot of ideas presented in the series, and then The Return helps substantiate a lot of ideas in Fire Walk With Me and helps thematically tie Fire Walk With Me in with Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire, and Eraserhead. Twin Peaks is sort of the centerpiece of Lynch's career in this regard, and Fire Walk With Me is the centerpiece within that centerpiece. So why Laura Palmer? Well, she exists at the heart of all of these problems. These various forms of narrative that uphold power structures in America, she is the victim of all of them. When you embrace Reagan's traditionalism, this is what you get. This is how it affects people. Laura lives a life of deep existential confusion, heartache, and danger because she is living the life that Reaganism produced. She's living out the media narratives about women, the societal narratives about tradition, the gendered narratives about the virgin and the whore. She is living on the cusp of so many broader cultural problems, and she is meant to be a reflection of those cultural problems as they would manifest. We see things from her perspective so that we can feel the pain that people have been feeling in this world that we've constructed, specifically the pain that women have been feeling in a patriarchal, hyper-conservative world. In part, she's the center of the narrative as media commentary. Giving her character humanity and some degree of autonomy counteracts the prior failure of the original show to do the same, and also continues the themes of the show commenting on media's brutal mistreatment of women and the way in which this is covered up by post-feminist appeals to tradition. Giving Laura a sense of personhood in the narrative of the film reestablishes the importance of who she was in order to not treat her as an object. The characters in the show treat her as an object, but the film goes to some length to give her subjectivity, give her humanity, and empathize with her perspective. As well, making Laura the centerpiece of the film helps spark this sort of reverberation effect. Her personal tragedy becomes the basis for insight into broader social, cultural, political, historical, and meta circumstances. The film greatly complicates her final days with the introduction of new aspects to it that were previously unexplored, such as the importance of electricity, Garmonbozia, the place above the convenience store, etc. The film allows us to ask questions about her life that the show left unexplored and bring it all back to her. And there's one more big reason why Laura is the centerpiece of the film that cuts to the heart of the narrative itself. Laura can see Bob. I described in my original show analysis how Maddie can see Bob only prior to her death. This is metaphorical in the sense that Leland is revealing himself to be violent and thus implied the killer of Laura. Maddie is becoming aware of Leland's role as an abuser. The same is true in Fire Walk With Me. Laura seeing Bob is Laura seeing that Leland is the one who has been abusing her this whole time. But what happens if we focus less on the metaphorical reading and more on the literal? Laura is aware of Bob. This is before Dale is aware of any of the spirits. He doesn't learn about Bob until his dream after her murder, and he doesn't see the spirits firsthand until Season 2, eventually confirming that they're real only at the very end of Season 2. As well, he's a member of the FBI involved in a team that specifically investigates paranormal events. There's a recurring theme about the intense damage done to people who discover too much. Philip Jeffries gets turned into a machine for attempting to figure out this weird spiritual side to the universe. Dale gets trapped in the Black Lodge. Wyndham Earle is killed. As well, Laura seems to die as a result of her discovery as well. But what really makes Laura so powerful is that she is on the verge of exposing this grander secret. If we analogize to the Matrix, Laura is on the cusp of leaving the Matrix on her own, without outside help. She sees Bob and is on the verge of exposing Bob to the world. In a metaphorical sense, this again means revealing Leland as an abuser, but in the literal sense it means opening the eyes of the people of Twin Peaks to the darkness and evil that is affecting their town, allowing them the opportunity to collectively oppose it. Effectively, Bob's murder of Laura is a cover-up, because in her last moments, she knows he's real. But, importantly, Laura leaves a trail of breadcrumbs which allows Dale the opportunity to eventually defeat Bob, even though it takes 25 years to actually do it. She writes Annie's message in her diary. She speaks to Harold about Bob. She pushes James and Donna away before Leland can get to them, particularly James. Whether intentionally or not, Laura's role becomes pivotal in defeating the spiritual sickness that pervades the town of Twin Peaks. Laura has a light detective streak in the film, trying to inquire about Bob, about the strange electricity in her room, keeping a secret diary that she shares only with Harold. She seems to also be looking to Mrs. Chalfont and her grandson. Laura is trying to understand some deeper level of truth than the others in her town, and it's motivated primarily by her lack of freedom. She is trying to find an existential purpose, and through this, she is on the cusp of reaching that deeper level of truth. And she does so quicker than Dale, and without the world's best resources at her disposal like Philip Jeffries. In a sense, she has great power. And her great power is due to the fact that she could, and eventually did, expose the various facades, the various unrealities of her world for what they were, allowing others to find the dark truth underneath. She exposed Leland as an abuser, exposed the town as a front for crime and corruption, exposed America's traditionalist culture as a front for violence and exploitation, and exposed media's normative messaging as a front for misogyny. These are all things which interfere with existential well-being. Our existential purpose requires acknowledgement of the architects of our unreality, the people with power who want to see to it that we don't get to live our lives for ourselves. In the show, that's Ben, Jerry, Leland, the Renault family, and Bob. In our own lives, historically it was Reagan, neoliberal and neoconservative politicians, and the capitalist class that controls the media and proliferate conservative messaging while attempting to strip away rights from marginalized groups. Laura is so important because her life and her death gives us the opportunity to recognize the architects of misogynistic violence both in media and outside of it in our broader national circumstance. Curiosity and naivete have a strong relationship with one another, but when curiosity leads one down a dark road, naivete dies, and a drive to fight the darkness should result. In a way, Laura is both Dorothy and Jeffrey, both the object of curiosity and the curious mind. Recognizing the importance of that drive to know more, to strip away the naive and find the truth, and to fight for a better world through it, is crucial. Laura is looking for an existential purpose, and she comes to find rather brutally that the thing depriving her of that purpose is her own father, and her father is a representation of her community and the general systemic oppression of women. This ultimately breaks her, but it plants a seed, the seed of curiosity that allows witnesses both in the show and audiences watching the show to begin to ponder our broader existential circumstance. That planting of the seed that allows us to engage with our own existential purpose in the face of systematic abuse is what was missing from the show that needed to be seen, and it's what makes Laura so important to this series. It'll be hard to recap everything I discussed since it was so much and so multifaceted, but here's a summary of what I think are the important points. Fire Walk with Me is a film split into two narratives. The first, centering around Special Agent Chet Desmond, FBI Agent Dale Cooper, and the town of Deer Meadow, begins with a presumed masculine perspective, positioning Chet and then Dale as the presumed protagonist and audience surrogate, only to cast out on both characters and force the viewer to contend with the presupposition of masculine heroism baked into a lot of media narratives. Deer Meadow, the town, appears to be in a state of deep poverty, reflecting a counter-narrative to the Twin Peaks show about small-town America. In Deer Meadow, small-town America is portrayed more in terms of the trailer trash stereotype, as a reflection of the way in which failed economies lead to a serious spiritual sickness that permeates. This set of circumstances allowed for Teresa Banks, the first victim of Leland Palmer's killing spree, to die without anyone caring about her. Economic failure begets despair, which creates convenient circumstances for misogynistic violence and exploitation. The second narrative centers on Laura Palmer in the final days leading to her death. The second narrative contrasts with the first by presenting Laura as the true protagonist of the film, forcing Dale into a backseat role and getting the viewer to begin to empathize with Laura rather than empathizing with Dale as he ponders Laura. This humanizes Laura and undoes some misogynistic assumptions baked into the original series. Laura is living two lives, which are playing into two stereotypes of women, known as the virgin and whore dichotomy. By day, Laura is playing out the stereotypical virgin, a popular preppy girl who dresses nice, and is generally on her best behavior when seen by others, and lives up to traditional models of femininity that were prevalent in the 50s and which Twin Peaks as a series is commenting on. By night, Laura is playing out the stereotypical whore, being a literal prostitute, dressing in provocative, highly sexualized clothing, engaging in drug use, and appealing to men sexually. Importantly, neither of these images of her are the quote-unquote real her, and both are performances she puts on for the sake of a patriarchal society. In the former, she puts on the image of the virgin in order to appease the demands of her father and of polite society, and in the latter, she puts on the image of the whore in order to please the men who are trafficking her so that she can get money and drugs that she uses to escape the abuse from her father. Her father is abusing and sexually assaulting Laura, forcing her into the virginal image and growing increasingly paranoid about her taking up another lover, thus breaking with the virginal image and potentially leading to the reveal that Leland is a bad father and an abuser. Leland has two images that he keeps up, one of the good father and one of the abuser, and only Laura is allowed to see his abusive side, so he spends a lot of his time trying to cover up his abuser side so that he can maintain good standing in his community. This results in Leland killing Teresa, who is threatening to reveal that he's cheating on his wife. Dale, trapped in the Black Lodge, is forced to contend with Laura's final days from an empathetic, non-heroic perspective in order to cast doubt on the archetype of the male heroic figure that Dale had fulfilled prior. This is partially to counteract patriarchal media narratives at the time that positioned men as the righteous heroes who women must rely on in order to be protected, by stripping away Dale's hero status and making him impotent in the narrative, thus allowing the audience to contend with what makes Dale good in the first place. The film litters weird surrealist elements throughout. Electricity is a conduit for trauma and a binding presence in 20th century American life, meaning that it both gives Laura the comfortable suburban conditions she has, but also permits the ability for Leland to abuse Laura. Electricity as an energy in the natural world can be used for good or for evil, and in the Palmer home it's used for evil. The fan is, in a way, a trigger for Laura, as Leland turns it on prior to sexually assaulting her, and Laura is forced to see it when she walks up to her bedroom where the sexual assault regularly occurs. The jade ring marks people for death, preserving the spirits of those who are good and eradicating the spirits of those who are corrupt and cruel. It's placed on the ring finger of the left hand, which Gordon refers to as the spirit finger in the return, implying that it exists to protect the spirit. As well, the same finger is the marriage finger, implying some vague connection between the jade ring and marriage. I personally speculate, without any substantial evidence in this case, that the jade ring somehow came from Mike. Mike cut off his left arm to sever the evil in his heart. His spirit had become corrupted, so he begun anew by cutting off the arm with the spirit finger on it, thus leading to the development of a second spirit, the man from another place, also known as the Arm. The Arm appears to look after the Jade Ring in the Black Lodge, which to me suggests that the Jade Ring was somehow created by Mike cutting off his arm, implying that his commitment to goodness has manifested in a ring that protects fellow good spirits from being corrupted or destroyed by Bob. Garmonbozia as a substance which resembles creamed corn is the literal pain and sorrow that people feel. The reason it resembles creamed corn is as a reference to the history of American exploitation of the indigenous people and the natural resources of the land. As industrialization further moved us into a detached way of living from the natural world, the assimilation of corn into industrial capitalism by American society resulted in a popular 50s dish, creamed corn, which is in effect the commodification of a natural resource that didn't belong to white settlers, but to the indigenous populations. This commodification of goodness into something processed and unhealthy is a metaphor for the exploitation of our spirits, our bodies, and our lives that the spirits of Twin Peaks are engaging in. They feast off of creamed corn that comes from our souls, because they are exploiting us to use as a resource for their own benefit, much like we did to the natural resources of the Americas, with corn being perhaps the most prominent example of such occurrences. The spirits of the town aren't old spirits, but are new spirits, spirits that manifest from the decaying industry and serious environmental and sociological sicknesses that are occurring in postmodern life. Capitalism is destroying our natural environment and increasingly removing us from it. As industries begin and die, the corpses of abandoned infrastructure are negatively affecting us, and this negative effect manifests metaphorically in the various spirits of the town. When we treat the land and fellow humans as expendable for the sake of capital, we create an unwellness that permeates our lives, and this unwellness becomes, in the canon of the show, spiritual darkness like Bob, the Arm, the Jumping Man, Mrs. Chalfont and her grandson, etc. Some of these spirits exist to oppress and destroy us, but others exist to warn us of an even graver danger, the danger of the complete destruction of our natural world and eventual annihilation of life on Earth due to capitalist production eventually eating itself alive. Laura is at the center of all this, being a girl whose existence as the descendant of colonizers and immigrants removes her from her homeland, places her into a suburban facade without a connection to her history, her environment, or the land's history, or even the people around her. She has no existential purpose because colonization, capitalism, and patriarchy turned her into a mere object for exploitation from white men. She lived her life being allowed to be nothing but a body for consumption from men in her life. Despite this, she has great individual power, and she has the ability and drive to expose the darkness that permeates her life to others. It's just that nobody listens to her or gives her the chance. So she goes to her grave, leaving behind little pieces of goodness that others can hold with them. Those pieces of goodness leading eventually to Dale discovering that Leland is the one who killed her. Her life was ultimately not lived in vain, and her life and death reverberate through her town, her world, her universe, and through media itself, exposing within all of these the architects of the unrealities that allow her exploitation. Namely, white men with power who are seeking to uphold American traditionalism. In the story, that's Leland, Ben, the Renaults, and others. In real life, it's Reagan and the conservative capitalists whose media narratives worked to squash dissent to conservative power. This is the shortest summary I can write, and it's very difficult not to cross-reference with Lynch's other works, especially because Fire Walk with Me is such a pivotal moment for Lynch. Lynch rejected the basic narrative form that most films adhered to, and also abandoned the male heroic figure that Blue Velvet and the original Twin Peaks show had. He pivoted heavily to focusing on feminine perspectives, and does this pivot mid-film into Fire Walk with Me, almost sort of self-consciously rejecting his prior tendency to fall into the trappings of the conventions of film that lend themselves so well to Reagan's neoconservative ideology. From here on out, Lynch is basically done portraying men as heroes, and centers women's perspectives or else otherwise condemns the male leads that he does focus on. Thank you for taking a journey with me into Fire Walk with Me. If you made it this far, I appreciate the attention, and I hope you like some of the perspective I've given to the film. As I said before, I'm not trying to theorize a canon for the series too much or solve it, but rather to explore various meanings that I see in the film and the series more broadly. I'm bringing in my knowledge of US history, the history of media, and sociological theories, including postmodern and feminist theories. These are the frameworks I'm using for my understanding of Lynch's work, and if you like this video, then I definitely recommend looking into some of these theories and histories for yourself. In the next video, I'm going to be jumping ahead to 1997 with Lynch's divisive, countercultural, surrealist neo-noir and first film in the fan-dubbed Los Angeles trilogy, Lost Highway. Stay tuned.